In the quiet neighborhood of Houston, life moved at a steady pace for Jeffrey Wright and his family. Their home, nestled on a tree-lined street, radiated warmth and stability, or so it appeared from the outside. Jeffrey, a successful businessman in the oil industry, was a man of routine. His days were filled with meetings, strategies, and endless calls. He found comfort in his work, believing that securing his family's future was all that mattered. Susan, his wife, was the picture of domestic bliss. She took care of their 2 children, kept the house pristine, and supported Jeffrey's career with unwavering dedication. Yet, as time passed, there was something in her demeanor that began to shift. It wasn't immediately noticeable, just subtle changes, fleeting moments where she seemed distant. But as weeks turned into months, Jeffrey could no longer ignore the growing silence between them. Susan, though outwardly content, felt a simmering loneliness that she had no words to describe. It wasn't that she didn't love Jeffrey. She did, or at least she used to. But as the years passed, she felt more like a caretaker than a wife. Jeffrey's focus on his career left little room for intimacy or emotional connection. The affection they once shared had dwindled, replaced by routine. She found herself yearning for something more, a feeling of being truly seen, of being valued beyond her role as mother and housewife. She tried to fill the void with small, fleeting escapes, coffee with friends, late-night walks, moments of solitude. But even these small comforts weren't enough to erase the growing emptiness inside her. The more she distanced herself, the more she felt trapped between the life she had built and the desire for something, or someone, more. Jeffrey, on the other hand, remained blissfully unaware of Susan's internal struggle. His world was busy, but predictable. He assumed their marriage was like any other, steady, secure. He was proud of the life they had together, proud of the family they had raised. He was oblivious to the creeping distance that had formed between them, convinced that everything was fine. It was easier for him to believe that everything was fine, to assume that love, once formed, would always remain. But love, as they both were beginning to learn, isn't always as steady as it seems. The first seeds of doubt were planted in the most innocuous of ways. A glance here, a comment there, nothing overt, nothing blatant. But it was enough to make Jeffrey pause, even if only for a moment. He brushed it off, attributing it to the stresses of everyday life. Then came the evening when Susan stayed out longer than usual. At first, Jeffrey thought nothing of it. She had gone to dinner with friends, he assumed. But when she returned, there was a strange quietness about her. The usual warmth in her voice had been replaced with an air of detachment. Jeffrey chose not to say anything. He was too tired, too busy with work to question her movements. But a part of him couldn't help but wonder, is everything all right? The question lingered, though he didn't yet know how to address it. Susan, meanwhile, was wrestling with a decision that had been plaguing her for weeks. She had started an affair with Mark Temple, a man she met at the local gym. Mark was everything that Jeffrey had stopped being, attentive, present, and emotionally available. It started innocently enough. Friendly conversations, shared laughter, and mutual understanding. But soon their friendship turned into something more, something Susan could no longer deny. In the quiet corners of her mind, Susan justified it. She hadn't set out to betray Jeffrey. She was simply seeking the connection that had long since vanished from her marriage. Mark had made her feel alive again, something she hadn't felt in a long time. But guilt gnawed at her. She didn't want to hurt Jeffrey, yet she couldn't stop herself from continuing down this path. As she looked at her husband, the man she had vowed to love forever, Susan felt a deep sense of conflict. She had no idea how much longer she could keep up the facade of the perfect wife. Each day felt like a lie, each smile a mask that hid the truth from the man she had once loved deeply. Jeffrey, as he continued to focus on his work, remained unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface of his marriage. He felt secure in the life they had built, never suspecting that his wife was slipping away piece by piece. He thought he could keep everything under control, but the universe has a way of revealing its secrets when we least expect it. The calm before the storm was settling in, but the thunder was already rumbling just out of sight, and when it came, it would shake the foundation of everything they had built together. The days passed quietly, But for Susan, the silence between her and Jeffrey had grown unbearable. She went through the motions of daily life, the chores, the school runs, the meals, but her heart was no longer in it. She had begun to feel disconnected, not just from her husband, but from the life she had once been so proud of. The weight of her secret hung heavily on her shoulders. Mark Temple was someone she never expected to fall for. It started innocently enough, with casual conversations after gym sessions, sharing laughs over protein shakes and exchanging glances that lingered just a second too long. But soon, that brief spark turned into something deeper, something Susan couldn't ignore. Mark gave her the attention and affection that had long since evaporated from her marriage. Every time she saw him, she felt alive again, something she hadn't felt in a long time. At home, things were different. Jeffrey, busy with work, hardly noticed the small changes in Susan's behavior. He still kissed her goodbye in the mornings, still asked about her day, but the questions had grown routine, lacking the warmth and curiosity that used to fill their conversations. Susan tried to push through it, to pretend that everything was fine, but the distance between them grew too wide to ignore. Her heart ached every time she looked at him, knowing how much she had been hiding from him. It wasn't just the affair, it was the loneliness, the isolation she felt every time she sat next to him on the couch, every time she lay beside him at night. They had become strangers, their once vibrant relationship reduced to quiet dinners and awkward silences. The emotional intimacy she craved had slipped through her fingers, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find her way back to him. She told herself it was just a phase, that things would get better. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Mark was her escape, her way of feeling seen again. When they were together, she could forget the pain of her failing marriage, the emptiness that consumed her at home. But every stolen moment with Mark only made her guilt grow heavier. She was torn between the love she once felt for Jeffrey and the thrill of the attention Mark gave her. She never planned for this to happen, but now she didn't know how to stop. One night, Jeffrey came home late from a business trip. Susan had been waiting for him, but instead of the warm greeting he was accustomed to, she barely acknowledged his presence. She had spent the evening with Mark, and the contrast was stark. Mark had made her feel like the woman she used to be, desired, seen, heard. But now, as Jeffrey walked through the door, she felt nothing but coldness. "I was thinking about making dinner," Jeffrey said, his voice casual but tired. "Something easy tonight." Susan nodded, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sure," she muttered. "Sounds good." The conversation between them was strained, awkward, like two people who had never really known each other. Jeffrey seemed oblivious, as always, too consumed with work to notice the tension in the air. But Susan couldn't hide it anymore. The guilt gnawed at her, and for the first time in a long while, she found herself questioning her choices. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Susan stared at the ceiling, the distance between them growing with every passing second. Jeffrey was asleep beside her, his breathing steady and calm, but Susan couldn't find peace. She reached for her phone, checking the time before sending a quick text to Mark. "I need you." It was a simple message, but it held all the truth she had been avoiding. She didn't know how much longer she could keep up this charade. Mark had become her refuge, but even as she typed those words, she knew she was only sinking deeper into the mess she had created. In the quiet of the night, Susan felt the weight of her secret pressing down on her. The facade of a perfect life was crumbling around her, and she couldn't stop it. She was lost between two worlds, one where she had vowed to be faithful, and the other where she was slowly falling for a man who was not her husband. And no matter how much she wished things were different, she knew it was too late to go back. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching longer than the last. Jeffrey couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His suspicion had been growing steadily, fueled by the small signs, Susan's late nights, her distracted demeanor, and the odd, fleeting conversations that seemed to leave more questions than answers. Tonight, as he sat alone in his office staring at his computer screen, his mind kept drifting back to her. He could no longer ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. What if she was cheating? What if everything he believed about their marriage was a lie? Unable to push the thoughts aside, Jeffrey made a decision that would change everything. He had to know. He couldn't live in this limbo of uncertainty. The idea of confronting Susan without proof made him uneasy. But what other choice did he have? The need for the truth outweighed the fear of what it might reveal. With a shaky hand, he reached for his phone and dialed a number he had never imagined calling, an investigator. His voice was tight with anxiety when he left the message, asking for someone to follow Susan, to find out what she was really doing when she wasn't home. The investigator, a gruff but efficient man, promised to begin the next day. Jeffrey could barely sleep that night, his mind racing with possibilities. As he lay in bed beside Susan, who was already fast asleep, he watched the rise and fall of her chest, her calm breathing contrasting sharply with the storm brewing inside him. The next few days were a blur. Every moment felt like an eternity as Jeffrey anxiously waited for news from the investigator. He tried to act normal around Susan, but his facade was crumbling, his suspicions eating away at him. Then, the call came. The investigator had followed Susan several times, and each time she had met with the same man, Mark Temple, the personal trainer from the gym. Jeffrey's heart sank as the truth began to take shape. His worst fears were confirmed. Susan's affair had been going on for months, hidden behind a veil of lies and excuses. The investigator had caught them together at a cafe, their intimate interactions undeniable. Jeffrey's hands shook as he listened to the details, each word from the investigator making his blood run cold. As the days passed, the realization of what Susan had done hit him with a force he wasn't prepared for. His mind spun with anger, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. The woman he had loved, the woman he had built a life with, had been lying to him for months. And all this time he had trusted her completely. The pain was unbearable, but it was the rage that began to consume him. How could she? Why didn't she come to him if she was unhappy? Jeffrey had spent years working tirelessly to provide for their family, to make sure they had everything they needed. But it hadn't been enough. She had turned to another man. His thoughts spiraled, each one more intense than the last. He found himself reliving the moments when Susan had brushed him off, the moments when she had seemed distant. The realization that it had all been a lie, their whole life together, was too much to bear. He couldn't keep pretending anymore. He had to confront her, to face the truth head on. But as the hours passed, the anger only grew. The emotions that had been festering inside him, hurt, betrayal, confusion, were now boiling over, and Jeffrey wasn't sure if he could control them. By the time Susan came home that evening, Jeffrey had already made up his mind. The confrontation was inevitable. He would demand the truth, and no matter what it was, he would finally face it. Susan walked through the door, her face lighting up when she saw him sitting at the kitchen table. But the warmth in her smile quickly faded as she saw the look on his face, tighter than usual, eyes colder than before. "Jeffrey, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. He didn't respond immediately. His heart raced, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. He couldn't look at her without seeing the betrayal. "Susan," he finally said, his voice strained. I know about you and Mark." The words hit the air like a slap. Susan froze, her face paling as the realization washed over her. She opened her mouth to speak but faltered, unable to find the words. Jeffrey's voice trembled with emotion. How long? How long has this been going on?" She stood there, her hands shaking, her eyes filled with guilt and regret. She had never imagined he would find out like this, but now that he knew, she didn't know what to say. "I never meant for it to go this far," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jeffrey's rage flared up again. "You never meant for it. You lied to me, Susan. You betrayed me. For months, you were with him and I—" His words broke off, his voice cracking with emotion. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His mind was spinning, but all he could think of was the pain that flooded his chest. Susan, now realizing the depth of his hurt, opened her mouth again, but nothing came out. Her lips trembled and her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. I didn't know what to do. I felt so alone." But for Jeffrey, the words were hollow. He couldn't hear her explanations anymore. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and worst of all, powerless. The life he had worked so hard to build was falling apart in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The room was thick with silence as they both stood there, staring at each other. The truth was out, and nothing would ever be the same. Jeffrey stared at Susan, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The confession hung between them, heavy and suffocating. The air in the room was thick with tension, as though the world had momentarily stopped spinning. He had never imagined this day would come, but here it was, standing before him in the form of Susan's tear-filled eyes and trembling hands. "You were seeing him all this time?" His voice was raw, a mixture of disbelief, hurt, and something darker, rage. His hands shook as he reached for the edge of the table, bracing himself. "How long has this been going on, Susan? Months? Years?" He couldn't stop himself now, the questions tumbling out one after another. I never meant for it to happen this way," Susan whispered, her voice barely audible. She wiped her eyes, but the tears kept coming, staining her cheeks. "I was lonely, Jeffrey. I was alone. And Mark, he was there for me. He listened when you didn't." Her words stung like a slap, and Jeffrey recoiled as if they physically hurt him. His chest tightened. He tried to speak, but his words got caught in his throat. He was suffocating under the weight of her confession, unable to breathe, to think. "Alone?" he finally managed, his voice growing stronger, but his emotions were spilling out of him, uncontrolled. "You were never alone, Susan. I gave you everything, this house, the kids, the life we've built, and you threw it all away for him? For someone who isn't even part of our world?" His voice broke with frustration, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Susan shook her head desperately, her words rushing out now in an attempt to explain herself. "I never meant for it to go this far, Jeffrey. I didn't know what to do. You were so focused on work, and I felt invisible. Mark, he saw me. He made me feel like I mattered again." The words were like daggers, cutting through the remnants of the life Jeffrey thought they shared. Every sentence, every justification only made him angrier. He couldn't understand how she could say these things, how she could betray him like this and then offer weak excuses in return. "You felt invisible?" Jeffrey repeated, his voice rising. "Is that supposed to make it okay? You went behind my back, lied to me, and now you're telling me it was because I was too busy?" The raw emotion in his voice was palpable, and Susan winced, as though his anger physically hurt her. But Susan, overwhelmed with guilt and regret, tried to make him understand. "I never wanted to hurt you, Jeffrey, but it wasn't just about being with Mark. It was about feeling something, anything. I didn't feel wanted, not by you, not like I used to." Jeffrey let out a bitter laugh, his eyes narrowing. "You didn't feel wanted?" He stepped closer to her, his gaze intense as though he was seeing her for the first time. "And now, you think I'm supposed to feel sorry for you? You've destroyed everything, Susan. You've destroyed us, our family. For what? For a fleeting moment of attention from some guy who never mattered in the first place." Susan opened her mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Her chest tightened as she realized the truth in Jeffrey's accusations. She had made a mistake, a horrible, unforgivable mistake. But what could she say? How could she explain how empty she had felt, how her desire for connection had blinded her to the damage she was causing? "Do you even understand what you've done?" Jeffrey's voice cracked, his anger now giving way to something else, pain. "I trusted you, Susan. I loved you with everything I had, and you threw that away like it didn't matter." His eyes glistened with unshed tears, the depth of his hurt finally surfacing. Susan was shaking now, but the tears were no longer flowing freely. They were replaced by a suffocating silence that seemed to echo louder than any words could. She didn't know how to make it right. She didn't know how to fix the irreparable damage. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Jeffrey shook his head, taking a step back as if the sight of her was too much to bear. "Sorry?" He laughed bitterly, the sound hollow in the otherwise quiet room. "Sorry won't bring us back. Sorry won't erase the fact that you chose him over me." He turned his back to her, trying to collect himself, but the pain was overwhelming. You don't get it, do you? He continued, his voice quieter now, but full of an almost dangerous calm. It's not just the affair, it's the lies, the deceit. It's the fact that while I was building a life for us, you were living a double life, and now you think you can just apologize and everything will go back to normal? Susan's heart shattered at his words. She knew he was right. She had destroyed everything, and no apology would ever undo the hurt she had caused. But the weight of her guilt pressed down on her so heavily that she could barely breathe. She could barely speak. I never wanted to hurt you, she repeated, her voice breaking. But I did, and now I have to live with that. Jeffrey turned to face her once more, his expression hard. You've made your choice, Susan, and now I have to make mine. The finality in his words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the chaos inside him. His decision was made, though he couldn't bring himself to fully understand what that meant yet. He walked toward the door, leaving Susan standing in the middle of the room, her heart in pieces. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Each breath Susan took felt heavier than the last. Jeffrey had left the room moments earlier, and Susan, still trembling, stood frozen in place. The silence in the house felt suffocating, each tick of the clock a reminder of how far they had fallen. She couldn't move, couldn't think clearly, as everything she had done rushed back to her. Her heart pounded in her chest, guilt pressing down on her with an unbearable weight. She thought of Mark, of how he had been the escape she had desperately sought. But now, standing in the aftermath of her choices, she couldn't help but see the destruction she had caused. There was no escaping the truth, no avoiding the consequences. She had lost him. She had lost everything. Suddenly she heard the sound of footsteps. Jeffrey was back. She braced herself, instinctively taking a step back as he entered the room, his eyes dark with the storm of emotion swirling inside him. He didn't say a word. His gaze was all she needed to understand that this was it, the moment of reckoning. Do you even know what you've done? Jeffrey's voice was low, dangerous with restrained fury. He wasn't shouting, but there was an intensity in his tone that made her freeze. She wanted to speak, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of her betrayal hung in the air like an impenetrable fog. Jeffrey wasn't waiting for an answer. His eyes were filled with a coldness she had never seen before, and it cut deeper than any sharp word ever could. I trusted you, he said, his voice tight with emotion, but his words were controlled. I gave you everything, and you destroyed it all. For what? A fleeting moment of comfort? His hand clenched into a fist, the anger barely contained beneath the surface. You think this is going to be easy for me? For us? Susan took a step forward, but Jeffrey held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. He wasn't interested in her excuses anymore. His heart was racing, every beat fueled by the rage and the sense of betrayal he couldn't shake. He had always believed in her, in their family, but now that belief felt like a lie, a cruel joke. The man he had been was slipping away, replaced by someone far less forgiving. I'm not doing this anymore, Jeffrey continued, his voice breaking slightly. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like you didn't destroy us. You betrayed me, Susan. You betrayed us. And I can't just look past that. Not anymore. His words sliced through the space between them, and for the first time Susan felt truly alone. Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't enough to change the gravity of the situation. She knew what she had done. The damage was irreversible, and no amount of apology could ever take it back. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the words could somehow undo the harm. But deep down, she knew they wouldn't. Jeffrey shook his head, his jaw clenched in anger. He was struggling to keep his composure, but every word from Susan only made him feel more hollow. Sorry, he repeated bitterly. Sorry isn't going to fix this. You don't get to just say sorry and think everything will go back to the way it was. You don't get to undo what you've done. The room felt too small, too suffocating as they stood facing each other. Jeffrey's eyes, once filled with love and trust, were now clouded with hurt and rage. The pain of betrayal, of realizing that his entire life had been a lie, was too much to bear. He couldn't stand the sight of her anymore, not when he knew what she had done, not when he knew she had given herself to someone else. I loved you, Jeffrey said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I loved you, Susan. And you destroyed that. You destroyed me." Susan collapsed onto the couch, the weight of his words breaking whatever strength she had left. Her hands shook as she buried her face in her palms, unable to stop the tears from flowing. She had ruined everything, and she couldn't take it back. For a moment, there was silence. The world outside seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them in this devastating moment of truth. Jeffrey stood across from her, his anger still simmering beneath the surface, but now it was tinged with something else, a deep, bone-deep sadness that had no place to go. He turned to leave, his back to her, but before he reached the door, he stopped, his voice hoarse. "I don't know what to do anymore, Susan. I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't even know if I can look at you the same way again." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need to. The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, and as he walked out, Susan was left alone in the suffocating silence, knowing that whatever was left between them had been shattered beyond repair. The storm had passed, and in its wake nothing remained but the wreckage of their marriage. Jeffrey stood in the living room, his mind whirling in a storm of emotions. The pain, the anger, the disbelief, all of it had coalesced into a singular, overwhelming urge. He couldn't just let this go. He couldn't let Susan's betrayal remain unpunished, even if he couldn't undo what had been done. The truth had already shattered everything he had believed in, but now there was a new question: what to do next? The answer seemed to come to him almost immediately. It wasn't justice he was after, not yet at least. No, it was control. If he couldn't save his marriage, he could at least regain control of the narrative. He would not let her walk away unscathed, unaccountable. With that thought in mind, Jeffrey began to plot. He would make sure that Susan's death wouldn't be a clean, neat affair, one that could be brushed aside. No, it had to be something else, something that no one could ignore. He moved toward the kitchen, his eyes scanning the area. There was a sharp knife on the counter, and the idea formed quickly, an act of desperation, a fit of rage. The pieces started to fit together. His mind, still clouded with the turmoil of betrayal, began to harden. This was his only option now. Jeffrey's heart pounded in his chest as he reached for the knife. His breath was shallow, quick. The plan seemed ridiculous, impulsive, and yet it felt strangely right. Every step, every detail clicked into place. The cover-up. He had to make it look like something else, something that would explain everything away, something that would shift the blame away from him. As he walked back toward the living room, where Susan was sitting on the couch, her tear-streaked face turned up to meet his eyes, Jeffrey's hands trembled. He didn't want to do this, but he felt cornered, betrayed, and that betrayal had to have consequences. Susan's voice was shaky as she looked at him, eyes full of fear and regret. "Jeffrey, please, Shut up, Susan." He cut her off, his voice harsher than he intended. The words felt sharp in his mouth. "You've ruined everything, and now you're going to pay for it." His grip on the knife tightened, and his mind grew clearer with each passing second. He didn't want to do this. He didn't want to go this far. But as his eyes locked onto hers, the decision was made. Susan recoiled, her eyes wide with shock and fear. "What are you talking about?" Her voice trembled with disbelief, but the panic in her eyes was unmistakable. "I loved you," Jeffrey spat, his anger bubbling to the surface again. "And you chose him. You chose him over me, over us. You tore apart everything I worked for. And now I have to deal with it. I'm not going to let you get away with this. Not this time." Susan stood up, but her movements were slow, almost hesitant. She backed away from him, her hands raised in a defensive gesture. "Please, Jeffrey, don't do this. You don't have to do this." The words echoed in Jeffrey's mind, but they didn't make him pause. The anger, the pain, the feeling of betrayal, all of it surged up in him like a tidal wave. He couldn't stop now. The hurt he felt from her infidelity had consumed him, and in that moment, he didn't see Susan, the woman he had once loved. He saw the enemy. He saw the person who had destroyed his world. As Susan turned to flee, Jeffrey acted. He grabbed her by the arm, twisting her around to face him. "You think you can just walk away from this?" he hissed through gritted teeth. "You think you can just walk away and everything will be fine? Susan screamed, trying to pull free from his grip, but Jeffrey's strength was too much. Her voice was high with panic now, her body shaking as she realized the danger she was in. "Please, Jeffrey, stop. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, please." But it was too late. The rage that had built up inside Jeffrey, the years of feeling neglected and betrayed, erupted. His hand moved quickly, and before Susan could react, the knife was in his hand, pressed against her. She froze, her eyes wide with shock and horror. For a moment, time stood still. The reality of what was happening began to sink in, and Jeffrey's breath came in shallow, ragged bursts. His mind was clouded with emotions, guilt, anger, confusion. But there was no turning back now. He had made his choice, and the consequences would come later. Susan's face was pale, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Please, Jeffrey, please don't." But Jeffrey didn't hear her anymore. His mind was a blur, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He had crossed the line, and once he crossed it, there was no coming back. The scene in front of him became a blur of frantic movement, the chaos of emotions, and the cold, hard reality that he had just committed something irreversible. As the situation escalated, he knew that nothing would ever be the same. The lies, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it had all led to this moment. And now, with Susan crumpled at his feet, he was left with nothing but the consequences of his actions. Detective Peterson leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. "Mr. Wright, we found inconsistencies in your story. Your wife's body was found in a different position than what you described. The knife wounds, the staging of the scene. It doesn't add up. Why did you choose to cover it up?" Jeffrey swallowed hard. He could feel the walls closing in on him. His heartbeat quickened, and a cold sweat began to bead on his forehead. He hadn't accounted for this. He had expected the police to follow the trail he had laid out for them, but now they were starting to question everything. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I didn't want her to suffer. I didn't want the kids to know the truth. It's easier this way. I just wanted it to be over." The words were meant to sound convincing, but even to his own ears, they didn't ring true. He could see the detective's skeptical expression, and it sent a chill down his spine. He had thought that if he made the murder look like a crime of passion, the police would back off. But now they were digging deeper, and their suspicion was evident. The days that followed were a blur of tense phone calls, more police interviews, and private moments where Jeffrey wrestled with guilt, regret, and fear. He knew his lies were beginning to unravel. The more the investigators looked into Susan's life, the more discrepancies they found. A breakthrough came when the police found a series of text messages on Susan's phone that contradicted Jeffrey's story. Messages between her and Mark Temple, exchanged just hours before her death. It wasn't just a simple affair. There were discussions about leaving Jeffrey, about making plans for a future together. This revelation painted a far different picture than Jeffrey had presented to the authorities. When Detective Peterson confronted Jeffrey with the new evidence, his heart sank. "Mr. Wright, these texts suggest Susan was planning to leave you. You claim she attacked you in a fit of rage, but these messages paint a very different story. What do you have to say about that?" Jeffrey's mind raced. The pressure was mounting, and he could feel the weight of the evidence pushing him into a corner. I don't know what to tell you. I didn't know about the texts. Maybe she was trying to cover her tracks, but she came at me. She was angry, and I had no choice." The detective wasn't convinced. "You didn't know? You mean to tell me you didn't see the signs? You didn't know about the affair, the plans to leave? All of this is starting to look like premeditated murder, Mr. Wright." For the first time, Jeffrey was unsure of his own story. The walls were closing in, and he could no longer keep the lie intact. He had planned the cover-up in such a frenzy of emotion that he hadn't anticipated the meticulousness of the investigation. Every detail was being scrutinized, every inconsistency examined. That night, as Jeffrey lay awake in bed, the truth began to settle over him like a weight too heavy to carry. He had done the unthinkable. He had killed the woman he once loved. He had killed her because of his anger, his pride, his unbearable feelings of betrayal. And now, there was no way to undo it. His heart raced as the images of that night played in his mind. Susan's fear, the knife in his hand, the rage that had overtaken him. What had he done? The investigation was far from over, and with each new revelation, the truth was slipping through his fingers. The lies he had spun so carefully were beginning to fall apart. The more the detectives uncovered, the more Jeffrey realized that he could no longer hide behind his facade. The truth was coming for him, and there was nowhere left to run. The days dragged on after Susan's death, the weight of the investigation pressing down on Jeffrey like an unrelenting storm. Though he had thought he had covered his tracks, the detectives were not giving up. Each new detail they uncovered made him feel like a cornered animal. The truth was creeping closer, and Jeffrey could feel it with every passing moment. It wasn't just his lies that were under scrutiny anymore. It was Susan's life, her relationships, her plans, her secrets. The police had begun to dig deeper into her past, unearthing information that Jeffrey never knew, information that would soon change everything. Detective Peterson walked into the interrogation room with a file in hand. He didn't look at Jeffrey at first. Instead, he placed the file on the table between them and flipped it open. The air between them grew heavy, thick with the promise of revelations. "We've uncovered something interesting, Mr. Wright," Peterson said, his voice neutral but his eyes sharp. "It seems your wife had a lot more going on than you thought." Jeffrey's heart skipped a beat. He had hoped that everything would stay buried. His story about Susan's anger and the self-defense killing was all he had. But now it was becoming clear that he had underestimated how deeply the police would go. "What do you mean?" Jeffrey asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but it cracked slightly. The detective slid a photograph across the table. It was a picture of Susan with Mark Temple, taken just days before her death. They were at a cafe, laughing together, close. Too close for comfort. But it wasn't the picture itself that rattled Jeffrey. It was the information that followed. "We found records of communication between Susan and Mark. Texts, phone calls, plans to meet up. Looks like she was preparing to leave you, Mr. Wright," Peterson continued, his tone almost casual, but the impact of his words was anything but. Jeffrey's stomach churned as the pieces started to come together. The affair was one thing, but this was something else entirely. The thought of Susan planning to leave him, to build a future with another man, was too much for him to comprehend. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the destruction of everything he had fought for, everything he had believed in. "You knew, didn't you?" Peterson's voice broke through his thoughts, his eyes piercing. "You knew she was planning to leave you for him, didn't you?" Jeffrey's mind raced, but no words came out. He couldn't form a coherent thought, not with the weight of the reality bearing down on him. He had loved Susan. He had given everything for her, for their family. And yet, she had been planning to walk away, to choose someone else. He had been blind, trapped in his own jealousy and hurt, unable to see what was really happening under his nose. I didn't know," Jeffrey managed to say, his voice weak. "I didn't know anything." "Do you think we're stupid?" Peterson shot back, his voice sharper now. "You don't think we see the signs, the lies, the inconsistencies? You think we're going to buy your story that she came at you in a fit of rage, that you had no choice but to defend yourself?" Jeffrey clenched his fists under the table, trying to hold himself together. He wanted to scream, to yell that none of this was his fault, that he had been pushed to the edge by a woman who had betrayed him. But deep down, he knew that the detectives weren't wrong. The truth had already begun to shift, and now he was caught in the web of his own lies. Mark Temple's involvement was becoming clearer by the minute. The affair wasn't just an affair. It was the catalyst for everything that had happened. Mark had been the one to light the spark that had burned everything to the ground. It wasn't just the affair. It was the plans, the future that Susan had imagined without him in it. And now it seemed that Mark was inextricably linked to Susan's death. Detective Peterson leaned in, his gaze unwavering. "We've been looking into Mark Temple's background. His connection to Susan wasn't just casual. He was a constant in her life. He was the one she confided in. And you, Mr. Wright, you were the obstacle in their way. You were the one keeping her from making a fresh start with him." Jeffrey's head swam. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Mark wasn't just the lover. He was the one who had given Susan the courage to make a change, to break free. And now, Everything that had happened, the violence, the murder, was part of that story. Jeffrey had become a part of something he hadn't even fully understood. "We know Mark was at your house the night of the murder," Peterson added, sliding another piece of evidence across the table. A text message from Susan to Mark, sent just hours before her death, confirmed that they had planned to meet. Mark Temple was supposed to be there that night, wasn't he? Jeffrey recoiled, his mind spinning. I don't know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He had thought that his lies had been sufficient, that his actions in the heat of the moment had been justified. But now, with each new revelation, he saw the cracks in his story growing wider. The detectives had unearthed the truth, and there was nowhere left to hide. The realization was inescapable. Mark Temple's role in Susan's life was far greater than Jeffrey had ever imagined. And now, with the investigation intensifying, the truth about Susan's death was beginning to come to light. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as Jeffrey Wright sat at the defendant's table. His hands, now cold and clammy, gripped the edge of his chair as he stared ahead at the judge. The walls of the room seemed to close in around him, the weight of the trial pressing heavily on his chest. His life, once a picture of stability, now lay in pieces before him. The prosecution had laid out their case with precision, and the evidence against Jeffrey was damning. The texts, the messages, the testimony from the private investigator, it all painted a clear picture of a man who had not only killed his wife, but had carefully planned the crime. The lies he had spun to cover his tracks were now unraveling one by one. Across from him, the prosecutor stood with confidence, ready to make his case. Jeffrey could see the determination in his eyes, the belief that they had the right man. It was as if the prosecutor already knew how this story would end. "You stand accused of the brutal murder of your wife, Susan Wright," the prosecutor began, his voice steady and commanding. "This was not a crime of passion. This was cold, calculated, and premeditated. You planned her death, and now you must answer for it." The words hit Jeffrey like a punch to the gut. He had been living with the guilt, the shame, ever since that night, but hearing the cold, hard accusations laid out in front of everyone felt like a final condemnation. He had never imagined his life would end up like this. Everything he had fought for, everything he had worked so hard to build, was now gone. He had ruined it all in a moment of rage, a moment he couldn't take back. The prosecutor continued, listing the evidence in excruciating detail. The crime scene, the knife, the position of Susan's body, all the inconsistencies in Jeffrey's story. But what hit hardest was when the prosecutor brought up Mark Temple. Mark Temple was not just a bystander in this tragedy, the prosecutor said, his gaze never leaving Jeffrey. He was the catalyst for the events that led to Susan Wright's death. And you, Mr. Wright, were the one who decided to silence her. You knew she was planning to leave you for him, and you couldn't accept that. So you killed her. The words felt like a slap, but they were true. Jeffrey had always known that Susan's affair with Mark was more than just a fleeting fling. But to hear it all laid bare in the courtroom, to hear his wife's final betrayal exposed in such a public way, made him feel like the very walls of the room were closing in on him. Jeffrey's defense attorney, a man who had remained quiet up until now, stood to make his opening statement. His voice was softer, more measured, but still filled with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the attorney began, "what you will hear today is not the story of a man who deliberately murdered his wife. What you will hear is the story of a man who was pushed to the edge. A man who, after years of emotional neglect, discovered that his wife had been unfaithful. A man who acted in a moment of overwhelming despair, who did not intend to take his wife's life but did so in a fit of rage." The defense attorney's words hung in the air, an attempt to humanize Jeffrey, to paint him as a victim of circumstances. But Jeffrey knew better than anyone that there was no excuse for what he had done. His anger, his hurt, had consumed him, and he had acted in the worst possible way. He couldn't undo it now, no matter how much he wanted to. The trial continued for days, each moment dragging on, the weight of the evidence against him growing heavier. The prosecution's case was airtight, and the defense's attempt to argue that Jeffrey had acted in self-defense fell flat. The jury seemed to hang on every word, but it was clear they were being swayed by the evidence, by the cold facts of the case. Every time the courtroom fell into silence, Jeffrey felt the walls closing in. He had never imagined this would be his life, sitting in a courtroom accused of murder with the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. And yet, as the trial unfolded, there was a strange sense of clarity. It wasn't just the evidence that had led him here. It was his own decisions, his own choices. He had chosen to react in anger. He had chosen to kill his wife. And now, as the trial went on, he realized that the consequences were unavoidable. The guilt, the shame, the anger. It was all his now. There was no one left to blame but himself. As the trial progressed, Jeffrey's mind began to slip into a fog. He heard the words of the prosecutor, the arguments of his defense attorney, but they seemed to come from a distance. The reality of what he had done, the irreversible act of violence, had settled into his bones. And as the jury deliberated, he was left to wonder if anything could ever make up for the life he had destroyed. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that made your heartbeat feel like thunder in your chest. Jeffrey sat at the defendant's table, his hands clenched into tight fists, his mind lost in a storm of thoughts. The jury had been deliberating for hours, and every second that passed felt like an eternity. The weight of the trial had taken its toll on him. His body was a shell of the man he once was, and his mind was a constant whirl of regret and self-loathing. He glanced at the jury box where 12 faces were now hidden behind a barrier of uncertainty. The foreman shifted in his seat, catching Jeffrey's eye for a brief moment. But there was no comfort in that glance, only the harsh reality that Jeffrey's fate was now in their hands. The defense had put up a strong fight. His attorney had pleaded for mercy, painting Jeffrey as a man driven to an uncontrollable rage by betrayal. But the prosecutor had been relentless. They painted him as cold, calculating, and driven by a sense of entitlement. And the evidence. The evidence had been damning. From the private investigator's testimony to the forensic evidence, everything pointed toward a planned, deliberate act of violence. The jury had seen it all. Jeffrey tried to hold on to the small thread of hope that the jury might find him guilty of manslaughter, that the circumstances might be enough to reduce the severity of the charges. But deep down, he knew the truth. He knew what he had done, and no matter how hard he tried to justify it, he could not escape the fact that he had taken a life. The woman he had once loved, the mother of his children, and now he was sitting here, waiting for the moment that would define the rest of his existence. The judge entered the courtroom, and the hushed murmur of the crowd stilled immediately. Jeffrey's heart raced as he tried to steady his breathing. His lawyer placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but the gesture did little to calm him. The judge called the room to order, and the moment had arrived. "Will the jury please rise?" the judge commanded. The foreman stood, holding the piece of paper that would seal Jeffrey's fate. His hands trembled as he read the verdict, his voice steady but betraying a hint of solemnity. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Jeffrey Wright, guilty of second-degree murder." The words hit Jeffrey like a freight train, the force of them knocking the breath out of him. His vision blurred, and for a moment he couldn't feel his legs beneath him. He had been expecting this, of course. His actions had led him here, but hearing the words out loud was a reality he wasn't prepared for. He could hear the gasps from the crowd, the whispers from the audience, but everything felt distant, muffled. The judge continued, but Jeffrey couldn't focus on the words. The weight of the verdict was suffocating. He could hear his lawyer's voice, but it was as if he were speaking through water. The courtroom had become a place of echoes, the truth of what had happened slowly sinking into his consciousness. He had killed Susan, and now he would have to live with the consequences for the rest of his life. The sentencing was swift. The judge, who had listened patiently to the trial, spoke in measured tones, outlining the terms of the conviction. 20 years. 20 years in prison for the crime of passion that had destroyed not only Susan's life, but also his own. As the judge declared the sentence, Jeffrey felt a strange sense of finality. He had been living in a fog for so long, trying to escape the reality of what he had done, but now there was no more hiding. He was going to pay for it. He would spend the next 2 decades behind bars. And even then, when he was released, there would be no redemption, no going back to the life he had once known. The courtroom began to empty, the sounds of footsteps echoing in the hall. Jeffrey remained in his seat, his hands still clenched, his mind a haze of regret and numbness. He could feel the weight of the chains that had now bound him, not physically but emotionally. He had lost everything, his wife, his family, his freedom. And now he would face the consequences, not as a man trying to justify his actions, but as a man who had no more excuses left. As he was led out of the courtroom, his eyes scanned the room one last time. His children weren't there. His friends weren't there. Only strangers, people who had been affected by his choices in ways he could never understand. There was no one left to stand beside him, no one left to comfort him. The silence that followed him as he was escorted down the hall felt colder than anything he had ever known. And as the door to the courtroom swung shut behind him, Jeffrey realized that he was truly alone. What do you think of Jeffrey Wright's actions and the outcome of his trial? Do you think justice was served, or was there more to the story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. From which region are you watching this video? We'd love to hear where our viewers are tuning in from.